Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Escape of Jack the Ripper, The Truth About the Cover-Up and His Flight from Justice, by Jonathan Hainsworth and Christine Ward-Agius. Narrated by Julian. Dramatis Personae. The Victims of Jack the Ripper. Smith, Emma. Attacked on Osborne Street, Whitechapel, by an unidentified gang on April 3, 1888, and died 4 days later in the London hospital. Retrospectively, she was believed by some to have been a victim of Jack the Ripper. Tabram, Martha. Murdered at George Yard Buildings, Spitalfields, by an unknown assailant on August 7, 1888. Retrospectively, she was believed by some to have been a victim of Jack the Ripper. Nichols, Mary Ann Polly. Murdered in the street, Bucks Row, Whitechapel, on August 31, 1888. Her throat was slit and her body had been horrifically mutilated post-mortem. Chapman, Annie. Murdered in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, Whitechapel, on September 8, 1888. Her throat was slit and her body had been horrifically mutilated post-mortem. Stride, Elizabeth. Murdered in Berner Street, Whitechapel, on September 30, 1888. Her throat was slit, no other mutilations. Eddowes, Catherine. Murdered in Mitre Square, Whitechapel, on September 30, 1888. Her throat was slit and her body had been horrifically mutilated post-mortem. Kelly, Mary Jane. Murdered in her lodgings at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street, Spitalfields, on November 9, 1888. Her body was horrifically mutilated post-mortem. The Mary Ann, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane are individuals whose murders are believed to be committed by Montague John Druitt. Mylett, Rose. Found deceased at Clark's Yard, Poplar High Street, on December 20, 1888. She may have been murdered by an unknown assailant by way of strangulation, there were no mutilation wounds, or possibly it was a death from a natural cause such as malnutrition. Some in the press ascribed the death to Jack the Ripper. Hart, Lydia. The dismembered remains of a woman were found in Pinchin Street on September 10, 1889. It was never satisfactorily established that it was the missing Hart's remains. It was believed by some to be a murder by Jack the Ripper. Mackenzie, Alice. Murdered by stabbing in Flower and Dean Street, Whitechapel, on July 17, 1889, by an unknown assailant, believed by many to be Jack the Ripper. Coles, Francis. Murdered by stabbing, throat cut in Swallow Gardens, Whitechapel, on February 13, 1891, by an unknown assailant who was believed by many in the press, the public and the police to be Jack the Ripper. Graham, Alice. Severely assaulted on February 15, 1895, with a knife by William Grant in Butler Street, Spitalfields. Grant was believed by some, including his own lawyer, to be Jack the Ripper. The Druitt Clan. The immediate family of Montague John Druitt. Druitt, Anne, née Harvey. Montague's mother. With her husband, Dr. William Druitt, she had 4 sons and 3 daughters. Suffering from depression, delusions, and clinical paranoia from midlife, she died in the Manor House Asylum at Chiswick, which was operated by the Tuke brothers. Druitt, Dr. William, Montague's father. He was a local doctor and surgeon in Winbourne, Dorset. He was a staunch member of the Conservative Party and the Church of England, and he was diligently involved in local philanthropy. Huff, Georgiana, née Druitt. Montague's oldest sister. She worked tirelessly as a mother, wife, and supporter of her husband's clerical career. She fell from a window and died in her late 70s in a suspected suicide. Huff, Reverend William. Montague's brother-in-law. He ran the Corpus Christi Mission, Old Kent Road, with his wife, Georgiana, and rose to the position of 2nd Bishop of Woolwich. Druitt, William Harvey. Montague's oldest brother. A solicitor, he ran a legal practice with a cousin, James Druitt Jr., in Bournemouth. He was the only family member to appear at the coroner's inquest into Montague's suicide and appears to have orchestrated a cover-up. Druitt, Montague John. born in Winbourne, Dorset, and educated at Winchester College and Oxford, committed suicide in the River Thames at Chiswick on December 4, 1888. A talented barrister of the Middle Temple, part-time teacher and talented sportsman, he was believed to be Jack the Ripper by certain members of his clan and by a handful of reputable outsiders. Druitt, Lieutenant Colonel Edward, Montague's younger brother who married a Catholic aristocrat and relocated to Australia and then Scotland. Druitt Arthur, Montague's youngest brother who became a schoolmaster in Scotland. Druitt Edith, Montague's second sister. Druitt Ethel, Montague's youngest sister. Within 9 years of her death, her late brother Montague was finally revealed to a journalist as the leading candidate for having been Jack the Ripper. Dr. Robert Druitt's family. Druitt, Dr. Robert, Montague's uncle and a famous physician, public health expert and promoter of the health benefits of lighter wine. He presented numerous papers concerning public sanitation, alcoholism and prostitution. He was the patriarch of the Druitt clan until his death. Montague was close to this wing of the family and was a regular visitor to their home in Strathmore Gardens, Kensington. Druitt Isabella, née Hopkinson, Montague's aunt, married to Dr. Robert Druitt. After her husband's death, she was looked upon as the matriarch of the clan. A strong and intelligent woman, she was dedicated to her immediate and wider family, as recorded in an archive of her family letters. We believe she knew the secret truth about her nephew Montague. Druitt Robert Jr., Montague's cousin who operated a legal practice with his uncle James Druitt Sr. in Christchurch. Druitt Reverend Charles, cousin to Montague. It is believed he took the latter's confession as Jack the Ripper. In 1888 he married Isabel Magendie Hill, the daughter of a step-cousin of Colonel Sir Vivian Magendies. Druitt Isabel Magendie, née Hill. Her marriage to Montague's cousin Charles linked the Druitts with the Du Boulay, Hill and Magendie clans. Druitt Emily, cousin to Montague, confidant to her mother Isabella Druitt and her brother the Reverend Charles. Druitt Gertrude, cousin to Montague, confidant to her mother Isabella Druitt and also the family's genealogist. Mayor James Druitt's family. Druitt James Sr., Montague's uncle, Mayor of Christchurch, 1850, 1859, 1867, 1888, 1896. Solicitor, coroner, justice of the peace and town clerk. James personally knew Colonel Sir Vivian Magendie and enjoyed a wide circle of influence. He commenced a family history book in early 1888, which he abruptly halted after Montague's suicide. He was one of the few to attend Montague's funeral. His son, James Druitt Jr., likely told him the rumours of Montague's deeds. He operated a legal practice in Christchurch with another nephew, Robert Druitt Jr., brother of Reverend Charles. Druitt James Jr., cousin to Montague and ran his father's legal practice, Druitt's Solicitors, in Bournemouth with his cousin, Montague's brother, William H. Druitt. From this legal practice, Montague undertook cases in London, including an important civil case shortly before his death. James Druitt Jr. was one of the few to attend Montague's funeral, and it is probable he would have learned of the events leading up to his cousin's suicide. He became mayor of Bournemouth in 1914. The Magendie de Boulay Hill clan. Hill Maria née de Boulay, mother of Isabel Magendie Druitt and Arthur de Boulay Hill. The marriages of her mother, Susanna née Ward, first into the de Boulay family and then as a widow into the Magendie family, united these clans. De Boulay Hill Arthur, brother of Isabel Magendie Druitt and closest friend of Reverend Charles Druitt. He was an assistant master at Winchester College during Montague Druitt's senior years and knew him well. He was a vicar at Downton, Wiltshire, and then East Bridgeford, Nottinghamshire. We believe him to be the North Country vicar who revealed to the public some of the truth about Jack the Ripper in 1899. De Boulay, Reverend J.T.H., brother of Maria Hill and deputy head of Winchester College during Montague's years there. Henry Grills Magendie, the son of his cousin Sir Vivian Magendie, lived with J.T.H. de Boulay and his family at Winchester. Magendie, Colonel Sir Vivian Deering, cousin of Maria Hill and J.T.H. de Boulay. a national hero as a bomb disposal expert and chief inspector of explosives at the Home Office. The colonel was very close friends with the police chief Melville Leslie Macnaghten and the popular writer George Robert Sims. Magendie Henry Grills, only son of Colonel Sir Vivian Magendie, attended Winchester College and lived with J.T.H. de Boulay and his family while attending school at Winchester. Magendie Lady Margaret, née Lindsay, sister of the 26th Earl of Crawford. She married Lewis Ashurst Magendie, a Conservative Member of Parliament and a cousin of the Magendie de Boulay clan. She was an author and known to George Robert Sims. Lindsay James Ludovic, Lord Crawford, 26th Earl of Crawford. Conservative politician, Member of Parliament for Wigan, brother of Lady Margaret Magendie, astronomer, bibliophile, philatelist and ornithologist. We believe he acted as a go-between for Mrs. Isabella Druitt and the police. The Crawford letter to Police Chief Dr. Robert Anderson about Jack the Ripper was written by him. Non-relatives who believed M.J. Druitt was the Ripper. Macnaghten, Sir Melville Leslie, a senior police chief who rose to become Assistant Commissioner of the Criminal Investigation Department. Knighted in 1907 and retired prematurely due to ill health. A close friend of Colonel Sir Vivian Magendie and George Robert Sims, he learned the Druitt family secret about Montague in 1891. We believe he orchestrated the second phase of the family's cover-up that required the public to be told something of the truth, but also to be misdirected away from the exact identity of the young barrister, who for public consumption became a middle-aged surgeon. He ensured that no one was wrongly charged and convicted for any of the Ripper murders. Sims, George Robert, best-selling playwright, poet, novelist, and a famous newspaper columnist, a very close friend of Melville Macnaghten and Colonel Sir Vivian Magendie. He diligently wrote a column, Mustard and Cress, on topics of public interest for the Referee. Sims was privy to the secret of Montague Druitt from 1891. His columns and short stories propagated a semi-fictionalized account of Montague Druitt as the Ripper. Edwardians were nevertheless privy to the basics. The case was not a mystery, as the killer had been an English gentleman and professional who drowned himself in the Thames River in 1888. Farquharson, Henry Richard, Conservative Member of Parliament for West Dorset, a neighbour of the Druitt family of Winbourne, and the West of England MP who first told people in 1891 that the deceased, unnamed Montague, was the killer. Nisbet, John Ferguson, Scottish-born journalist, writer and dramatic critic for The Times. A colleague and friend of George Robert Sims in the theatre world, he also wrote a regular column for the Referee, by then partly owned by Sims. Nisbet was the first to reveal to the public that the Ripper's family had tried and failed to hush up the homicidal truth about their Montague. Richardson, Frank. Educated at Marlborough and Oxford, he was a barrister of the Middle Temple in the chambers of Sir Charles Matthews, who had previously conducted court cases with Montague Druitt. Richardson was also a friend of George Robert Sims and a member with Sims, Macnaghten and Matthews of the Garrick Club. Proof that Richardson knew about Monty's double life is contained, albeit cryptically, in two of his long-forgotten novels from 1908, The Worst Man in the World and The Other Man's Wife. Maclaren, Christabel, née Macnaghten, Lady Aberconwy. Charming, liberal-minded, and iconoclastic, she was the third child and favourite daughter of Sir Melville Macnaghten. Lady Aberconwy secretly preserved and eventually disseminated a copy of her father's 1894 memorandum, which named Druitt as the leading suspect in order to protect her late father's legacy as the sleuth who had solved the case. Introduction. What mystery? The true identity of Jack the Ripper is not one of the world's great unsolved true crime mysteries, as so many scores of books and documentaries claim. The Victorian-era cases of poor women of the East End driven into prostitution by poverty and then murdered, some horrifically mutilated post-mortem, by an unknown killer was solved by a police sleuth. To be specific, the killer of 5 of about a dozen such Whitechapel murders between 1888 and 1891 was indeed identified, albeit posthumously. The police chief's solution was then shared with the general public in the last years of Queen Victoria's reign by means of his literary associates. Although it was a quasi-official announcement, in some quarters, even among ex-police detectives, it was greeted with open scepticism. And with good reason. The upper-class police chief had misled his middle-class colleagues with red herrings and dead ends, sharing his authentic inside information only with other upper-class men whom he personally trusted. With so much conflicting information floating around, the distance afforded to later generations interested in the case confused rather than clarified the mystery. By the Edwardian era, 1901 to 1914, the broad identity of Jack the Ripper was quite familiar to the public. According to those writer friends of the police chief, the murderer had been an English gentleman who had taken his own life in the Thames River at the very end of 1888. It was not considered appropriate to reveal the man's name because he could never defend himself at a trial. Nonetheless, to Edwardians, Jack the Ripper was not a mystery. He had been identified and was long deceased. It was only after the First World War that the case was resurrected by a new generation of writers and researchers who were unable to find this unnamed suicide in major newspapers or official records and consequently assumed, wrongly, that the entire story was nothing more than a myth. This basic misunderstanding has obfuscated the truth about Jack the Ripper for nearly a century. In the 1900s, the snobbish and sectarian among the so-called better classes sniffed at the Jack the Gentleman solution as almost an affront to decency. Instead of the fiends being satisfyingly revealed to have been some wretched foreigner, a Hebrew, an immigrant or indigent person, or a combination of all of the above, he was supposedly a middle-aged, affluent, though reclusive, semi-retired surgeon from a very prominent London-based family. Before he committed his atrocities, the surgeon had twice been a voluntary patient in insane asylums, where he confessed his maniacal desire to savage the East End's poor women. Why on earth was he ever discharged, people wondered. Once the murders began in 1888, the ex-surgeon's friends were desperately worried that he was the culprit. After his most grotesque homicide, they decided he must be recommitted to an asylum, but they found that the mad doctor had disappeared from where he lived. His frantic pals tried to find him. Failing in this endeavour, they made contact with Scotland Yard police chiefs, who, it turned out, had already ordered a fast-closing dragnet to arrest the insane medical man. Within a month it was learned that Jack the Ripper had cheated earthly justice by drowning himself at the river's embankment in the centre of the metropolis, his rotting corpse having resurfaced a month later. We now know that this was a careful mix of fact and fiction, and this book will try and untangle which was which. It is to the credit of the upper-class men who broadcast this solution that they were prepared to be so candid, up to a point. To them, the Ripper had been one of us, not one of them. This is the origin of the iconic image of the murderer as an English swell sporting a top hat, carrying a medical bag, and vanishing into the London fog like a malevolent, unstoppable Grim Reaper. The murderer's actual name only became publicly known when Britain and the world were in the thrall of Beatlemania, nearly a century after the murders had taken place. Only glimpses, footprints, and shadows survive about why contemporaries were so convinced this man was definitely the killer. These include members of his own family who surely would have resisted such an appalling notion if they could, as it threatened their standing in a class-stratified society in which reputation was all. The story of Jack the Ripper isn't missing a resolution. What is actually missing, oddly enough, is the middle of the tale. In the Whitechapel crimes, we have Act 1, the murders of destitute, vulnerable women in the East End. We have Act 3. Credible people of the time believed the killer was this Thames suicide who had outwardly appeared to be a gentleman above suspicion. We know the identities of those people and of the man who they believed was the murderer. It is Act 2 that survives only in fragments and which we have done our best to recover. Inevitably, we have had to use conjecture and speculation to make sense of this incomplete jigsaw puzzle. Some pieces have survived while others are lost and must be guessed at, though we argue we have made informed guesses based on sound research. Either these Victorians who believed the killer was this drowned gentleman were right, or they were wrong. Yet consider what an extraordinary thing it would be to be wrong about. After all, for different reasons, none of them wanted it to be him, least of all his own relations. Subsequently, the murderer's exact identity was rendered unrecoverable to the press and public by being semi-fictionalized just enough to safeguard his respectable family, who, in the altered account, became friends that responsibly alerted the police in 1888, when in reality their terrible secret was withheld from the authorities and only leaked in 1891. In this book, we have tried to reverse-engineer the missing second act's shape and substance from the too slick propaganda offensive of the late Edwardian years. Several authors have written exceptional works on this subject, adding to our overall knowledge and understanding of the late Victorian era. Recently, Hallie Rubenhold's award-winning The Five provided meticulous insight into the lives lived by the five victims, the specific victims, we contend, of the young English gentleman. A few authors have even grasped that it is a story with far more than an opening act, among them Stuart P. Evans, in collaboration with Paul Ganey, Jack the Ripper, first American serial killer, the late Tom Cullen with his masterly Autumn of Terror, Jack the Ripper, His Crimes and Times, and Martin Fido with his Crimes, Detection and Death of Jack the Ripper, though they all argued the likely guilt of different contemporaneous police suspects. By contrast, most other authors on this subject are unaware that a second and third act even exist, repeating the mistaken paradigmatic shift that emerged in the late 1920s. Many authors, commentators, and filmmakers concentrate almost exclusively on Act 1, usually winding it up with a dismissive addendum about how some Victorian police in their dotage unconvincingly propose their own pet suspect, and with each of their solutions being different, they ipso facto cancel each other out. Some tabloid-driven books detail dozens upon dozens of supposed suspects, including the most outlandish candidates, Oscar Wilde, Lewis Carroll, Walter Sickert, the Duke of Clarence, even poor Vincent van Gogh, completely oblivious that the case was solved in 1891 by a police chief, and the solution, albeit obscured, was semi-officially shared with the public within less than a decade. A few years ago, we published a well-received biography of that upper-class police chief. It tried to rehabilitate this once highly regarded, hands-on charmer from the clutches of so-called ripperology, so much of which has denigrated his memory by portraying him as a know-nothing cipher. It was also the first book ever to consider the reaction of the deceased murderer's family to seeing their drowned relative portrayed in the press, albeit unnamed, as Jack the Ripper. Ergo, that profile would have to be semi-fictitious to avoid a scandal or a lawsuit, and it is. Our previous discoveries include that the police chief had a close friend at the Home Office who was connected by marriage to a relative of the murderer's family, providing the former with a personal motive to hide the exact identity of the Ripper from his colleagues and the public. The murderer, brought up a Tory, was very likely a rogue convert to an extremist agenda that expressed itself in socialistically inspired, terroristic violence, an extraordinary notion first raised in 1888. We also argued that a tormented Jack had confessed his crimes to a clergyman, who convinced another clergyman to reveal the truth within 10 years, and that second vicar is provisionally identified here for the first time. This clergyman's intervention forced the discreet police chief's hand. He had to deploy his own semi-fictionalized version of the truth ahead of this turbulent priest. In this book, for the first time, we reveal the textual proof that the gentleman who later partially disguised the murderer's identity originally knew his authentic particulars, that he was young, not a qualified doctor, and had expressed remorse for his crimes and killed himself in the middle of a series of about 12 homicides of poor women known as the Whitechapel murders, and not conveniently at their conclusion. Our other new discoveries include letters written by the murderer's family from a valuable archive surprisingly neglected by researchers on this subject. This was a family of prolific letter writers, yet for the period in question, from the second half of 1888 to mid-1889, the archive is almost non-existent. This gap is a disruption of their regular pattern of writing to one another, so one could reasonably surmise that the letters from this crucial period were destroyed, and letters by members of the same family composed a year later show, quite unlike their earlier correspondence, a use of cryptic phrasing regarding something that is causing strain. We make the case that the barrister and part-time teacher who was the probable murderer briefly dabbled in medicine as a career before switching to law. We argue that it was very likely that the blood-stained gentleman maniac had been detained by the constabulary in Whitechapel, but had managed to bluff his way to freedom. We make a circumstantial case that his family placed him in an asylum in France under an alias, an elaborate and expensive manoeuvre that floundered almost immediately. Perhaps most intriguingly, we found that before these infamous murders, the barrister had defended a murderer in court by trying to shift the blame onto his client's wife, a woman who worked as a prostitute. One of our most conclusive discoveries is a source from 1894 by a writer who learned the truth almost certainly from that same police chief. It perfectly encapsulates our thesis of a family cover-up which partially fell apart as, obviously, it has reached the public domain. The relatives of Jack the Ripper did at last know or suspect the truth about their charge, though, for reasons that can be well understood, they preferred to hush up the affair. Chapter 1. In Defense of Murder. A little more than a year before the so-called Jack the Ripper murders that would later transfix millions, a heinous crime was committed in an English seaside town. It is hard to conceive of anything more despicable than a lethal assault upon a defenseless baby, yet this monstrous act had been committed by a previously law-abiding citizen, leaving his community dumbfounded. The perpetrator had seemed incapable of such a horrific act until the night he asphyxiated his unwanted stepson. On February the 12th, 1887, in the picturesque coastal town of Poole in the county of Dorset, the shoemaker Henry William Young said goodbye to Elizabeth Young, née Juggs, his young and heavily pregnant wife of only a few months. She was departing from their modest two-story abode on Deer Hay Lane to go shopping. Her regular nocturnal grocery expeditions could take up to several hours. The port town of Poole had fallen on hard times. Once a transportation and commercial hub, the town's shallow port was unable to accommodate the larger vessels now used in international trade. Fortunately, tourists were flocking in ever greater numbers to enjoy Poole's sunny beaches. Along with thousands of other struggling women across an England devoid of even a rudimentary welfare system, Elizabeth Young made ends meet by selling her body. Her 27-year-old husband would have been expected to confront his wife and beg her to desist from such shameful and scandalous behaviour. In Victorian society, reputation was all, and Henry was known by the local townsfolk to be industrious and honest, a Sunday school teacher and a member of the Blue Ribbon Army, a most quiet and inoffensive young man, as one newspaper would later praise him. As accorded with Henry's placid nature, he expressed no misgivings about bringing up Elizabeth's illegitimate baby from a previous liaison as his own. The child was named Percival John Ings. However, behind the respectable husband's facade of a quiet-spoken, church-going good chap, a cancerous rage must have metastasized inside him against a vulnerable innocent. Did Henry Young daily limp down the streets of Poole, he had a wooden leg, feeling humiliated by the whispered derision of his fellow townspeople? Poor cripple, poor cuckold, does he not know where his wife really goes at night? He did know, but he also knew that the couple needed the money. What he could no longer cope with was her attention to a child not his own, with another child on the way. He hoped to save Elizabeth from her sinful life, but his income remained stubbornly meagre, just a few coins ahead of eviction. Night after night, Henry Young sat at home staring at a 10-month-old baby who was not his. Was the child the living, intolerably irritating reminder of his wife's double life and of his own impotence to halt her continuing to live it? Like many Victorian domestic would-be murderers, Henry Young initially tried his hand at poison and failed. He was presumably trying to discreetly eliminate little Percy by making his death appear to be by natural causes. Children died like flies in Queen Victoria's England from cholera, typhoid fever and consumption, a veritable legion of diseases caused by foully polluted water and overcrowded homes. Too often, people of all ages collapsed as a result of inhaling the black, noxious gunk exhaled daily into the air by Britain's industrial lungs. What difference, Henry must have calculated, would one more pitiful tyke's passing really make? For the cost of some soda from the local chemist, a Mr. Williams, mixed with milk and water, Henry could have removed with one stroke this blemish from their lives while denying Elizabeth her economic motive for being on the game, there being too many mouths to feed. On the night of February the 8th, 1887, a sick Percy was alarmingly spewing up blood and phlegm. The local doctor, Lawton, was summoned when the crisis was most acute, and though he was perplexed by the baby's symptoms, he did not suspect foul play, nor, unfortunately, did the baby's mother. After all, as Elizabeth would later lament, she and her husband had not once quarrelled about the stepchild, and Henry had never so much as hinted at intending violence against anybody. 4 days later, Elizabeth returned from shopping much earlier than usual. She found her husband in a strange pose, standing perfectly still in the downstairs room, staring into blank space. Not a sound could be heard from little Percy upstairs. "Is he asleep?" Elizabeth asked. "No," came the reply from her zombie-like spouse, her query not breaking the spell of his fascination with the opposite wall. Reaching the upstairs bedroom, Elizabeth was shocked to find the fire out and the dark interior as cold as a cemetery. As her gaze accustomed to the gloom and swung to the bed, Elizabeth let out a blood-curdling scream. The blanket she had left securely up to her baby's chin had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?